I've been playing the Elden Ring base game for about a year, and recently finished the Shadow of the Earth 3 DLC. After that, I started browsing YouTube for lore videos, mainly to see how other players interpret a story and to deepen my understanding of the game's world. What surprised me, though, was how confused I felt watching many of these analyses. A lot of creators and commenters judge Miquella's actions through a strictly objective framework of good and evil, and unsurprisingly, they struggle to make sense of him within those terms. Most lore discussions like to emphasize the philosophical influence present in the game, yet it is striking how just a few channels approach Miquella or Elden Ring as a whole from a genuinely Nietzschean perspective. It becomes even more ironic when people readily point out Berserker's influence while completely ignoring the beyond good and evil dimension that the game so openly presents. Now, I know there are plenty of videos overanalyzing the DLC's lore, so I will focus instead on my own experience playing the game and the conclusions I personally drew from it. Don't worry, I defeated all of the bosses and completed most of the available quest lines, so my perspective is grounded in first-hand experience rather than surface-level impressions. Most of my experience in the game revolve around exploration and boss fights, but I encountered the major NPCs fairly early on, and they were all talking about seeking Miquella and related things. At the time, I didn't pay much attention to the lore, which led me to clear almost every other boss fight, leaving Messmer and the later consort Radahn for the very end. Since Radahn was overwhelmingly strong and I entered the DLC on New Game Plus 3, I was eventually forced to engage with the lore more seriously. I needed to hunt for items, follow quest lines, and understand what was actually happening in order to unlock more spells and tools that would give me a real chance in those fights. Putting the pieces together only near the end was surprisingly rewarding, and even though Consort Radahn is the final boss, I don't think he's the most aesthetically compelling figure in the game. For me, Messmer stood out far more, while Miquella clearly embodies an aesthetic of the will to power. I've seen many comments focusing on Miquella's so-called good deeds and framing them as altruistic, but from a lore perspective, he is essentially accumulating power and attempting to impose control over everything around him. And that's precisely the point. He is neither good nor evil. Of course, we can judge all of this from an outsider's perspective, but within the logic of the game, Miquella is essentially completing yet another cycle in which the ends justify the means. This is fundamentally Nietzschean conclusion. Truths are not discovered, they are created in order to legitimize a particular will to power. In the end, Miquella is trying to put an end to a punishment imposed on others by those who had punished their own kind millennia ago. It's a recursive cycle of guilt and retribution, very similar to the cycle of hatred portrayed in Naruto. And when it comes to Messmer's aesthetics, I'd argue that he is even more accurate in Nietzschean terms. He quite literally uses suffering as a means to accumulate power. This is shown in his design and especially in his second phase scene. Messmer's design alongside Rinalla's is among the best in the game. In fact, he ended up being my favorite boss, especially because the experience of fighting him felt perfectly balanced. While many channels analyze Messmer's actions through objective moral standards, I will stick to my usual philosophical approach, to the same one I use when analyzing Dark Souls. We can really claim that Messmer committed crimes because there is no neutral or intermediate system of judgment within the game's world. His entire crusade unfolds as a direct execution of what is presented as a higher will, embodied in Marika's commands and justified under the authority of the greater will. Elden Ring's underlying philosophy suggests that power does not operate according to objective moral frameworks, nor is it constrained by religion or by ideals of universal domination. If we insist on applying an external moral lens to these characters, we end up either condemning everyone as evil or reducing them all to vague moral contradictions. And in Messmer's case, what ultimately drives him is his absolute devotion to his mother. He follows her will to the letter, and that loyalty becomes the core of both his identity and his actions. Messmer's decision to continue his crusade against the impure, even after discovering that the Tarnished was sent by the Golden Order, reveals just how unwavering he was in adhering to his newly fixed idea. Even then, he remains faithful to his mother's command, and that fidelity crystallizes into an aesthetic of tragic obsession. This was his purpose, and without it, he could not meaningfully exist. This is where Nietzsche's notion of the insignificance of the guilt, especially as developed in Beyond Good and Evil, when applied to Messmer, guilt loses its moral weight and becomes irrelevant. What matters is not moral accountability, but the intensity with which a will affirms itself through action. Messmer cursing his mother after his defeat shows how truth shifts according to the context. Likewise, Marika's use of him and her complete disregard for his devotion reveals how guilt itself is also contextual rather than absolute. Because of this, it becomes extremely difficult to identify a villain in any objective sense, or even to meaningfully label someone a criminal. In a world ruled by demigods, warped by strange curses, and structured around fate, such distinctions lose their footing. Sin is not the result of moral judgment, but an innate condition tied to the kind of being one is. Marika herself is fragmented, and her offspring inherit that fragmentation in the form of curses rather than choices. Many people pointed out that Miquella doesn't fit the mold of a conventional villain, largely because his eternal youth curse traps him in a childlike mindset. And, aesthetically speaking, the lore makes it clear that even the purest intentions, or even a god's claim to ultimate goodness and will, still rely on evil, or, at the very least, profoundly immoral actions. Much of the DLC's exploration revolves around finding Miquella's crosses, or fragments of himself, so to speak. This creates a striking contradiction. A figure attempting to purify himself of sin and curses while simultaneously accumulating power through morally reprehensive means. Miquella manipulates NPCs tied to different lords, exploits Mog to gain access to the Shadow Realm, and long afterward uses his body to resurrect and zombify Radahn as his consort. Miquella's aesthetic ultimately illustrates how love and compassion can devolve into possessive behavior and tyrannical rule. This aligns closely with how classical philosophy understood love, especially in its recognition that virtues can easily collapse into vices when taken to their extremes. Had Miquella succeeded in becoming an absolute god, he would indeed have transformed the world, but at the cost of free will itself. This consequence is already foreshadowed in the imagery and symbolism surrounding Cetrina. For this reason, I don't think Miquella is truly comparable to Griffith. Griffith's actions are fundamentally selfish from the very beginning, and he consistently views those around him as mere subordinates. Miquella, by contrast, represents a deviation of the Christian, specifically Christ-like ideal of universal love and non-aggression, even though the very nature of his power inevitably gives rise to coercion and violence. Throughout the DLC, Miquella's actions serve as a clear example of a beyond good and evil dynamic, where even seemingly benevolent intentions function as egotistical expressions of an individual's will to power, and moral frameworks exist primarily to legitimize those actions. I've seen many people describe Miquella's behavior as selfless, but that interpretation simply doesn't hold up. He is a compelling villain and a genuinely complex character, someone attempting to reshape the lands between and correct his mother's failures by imposing a world of eternal devotion governed by his own ideal of perfection. In that sense, Miquella's aesthetic fits perfectly within the fantasy world of Elden Ring. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. See you in the next one.